Okay, welcome back. So this is number 3, our third video in hurricanes. So we were talking about how a hurricane develops. The very first stage is a tropical disturbance. This is just a little area of low pressure. It may not even be a closed low where we've got those counterclockwise winds all the way around it. But you had some cloudiness, some precipitation, not a lot though in the way of very strong winds. But it's an area that's of just disturbed weather, for lack of a better term. A lot of thunderstorms, just some disturbed weather. So at this point, sometimes the hurricane hunters, which are actually based out of Keesler Air Force Base in Biloxi, a lot of times they will go investigate these systems. They will see if they can find a closed area of low pressure. They will drop what are called radiosondes. There's a tube in the bottom of the plane. It's really cool. I've flown with them a couple of times, always during training missions. I never got to go into a hurricane. I wish I had. But they have a tube that goes through the bottom of the plane, and they put a big round cylinder in it, and they shoot that cylinder out through the bottom of the plane. And as it falls, it measures wind speed, it measures temperature, it measures dew point, and all those things that are critical. So they'll fly a very specific pattern through that disturbance, kind of an X. And they'll see where the winds are. If the winds are closed, if they're not, meaning if they're going in a counterclockwise around a center of circulation. But if not, if they're just kind of, winds are kind of here, there, and yonder, but it's still kind of messy weather, it will be classified as a disturbance. So winds are generally less than about 25 miles an hour. The next stage anyway, is what is called a tropical depression. At this point, it will become tropical depression number 1 or number 2 or number 3 or wherever we happen to be. This is when it gets that closed circulation. When you see those winds rotating around a common center, just like a low pressure, in a counterclockwise manner. At this point, sustained winds are at least 25 miles an hour. There's still some disorganization. Doesn't look like a classic hurricane at this point, but at least you see that spin. You're starting to see a little bit of that spin if you watch a satellite very closely, and you can kind of see those clouds beginning to rotate. The next stage is a tropical storm. This is where the storm actually gets its name. And it becomes a tropical storm when winds reach at least a minimum of 39 miles an hour. A tropical storm is capable, if it happens to make landfall, is capable of causing minimal damage, at least wind-wise, but it can cause torrential damage rain-wise. We saw that a couple of years ago in Houston. That wasn't actually a hurricane that hit, but it just kind of sat. There weren't a whole lot of very strong upper-level winds. It couldn't move anywhere. It just kind of sat, and it just dumped inches upon inches upon inches of rain over the city of Houston. So tropical storms, you may not think they're very damaging or deadly, but they can be, especially if they just kind of sit over one area for a very prolonged period of time. Then, once the winds become to a minimum level of 74 miles an hour, then it becomes an actual hurricane. At this point, it does have that closed circulation, and it has that very distinct eye right there in the middle. And hurricanes, really of all stages, are very capable of causing significant damage. So, one other thing. So kind of if you look at your PowerPoint, where do these storms actually form? Well, it depends on which month we're in, where these storms tend to form anyway. In June, we see a lot of formation in the Gulf of Mexico. It's a little bit shallower in the Gulf of Mexico than it is out into the Atlantic. So therefore, it doesn't take quite as long for that water to heat up. Anybody who's been to the beach in June knows just how warm the Gulf of Mexico can be. So we get a lot of development in the Gulf of Mexico in early summer, around June. In July, we're also still seeing some development in the Gulf of Mexico, but we're starting to see a little bit more in the Caribbean as well. Then by the time we get into August, we're seeing a lot of development. One of the hot spots is really the portions of the water that are around the Caribbean. But we're also having to watch the west coast of Africa. A lot of times, and Andrew actually did this, Andrew formed as a storm over Africa, over the continent of Africa, moved off the coast, then went all the way across the Atlantic. So these are called Azore storms because they kind of go past those islands. Sometimes these hurricanes will turn right up the east coast of the United States and just kind of keep right on turning. Any storm that forms but then stays out over open water is called a fish storm, just because it's only going to affect fish. However, sometimes these storms will kind of scoot right in between the Yucatan Peninsula and the Caribbean and kind of get into the Gulf of Mexico. Sometimes they'll shoot right up the east coast of the United States, but we see a lot of development coming off the African coast and also in the Caribbean as well. By the time we get into September, virtually every place is a hot spot for hurricane development. The Gulf of Mexico, off the coast of Africa, throughout most of the Atlantic. So we can see a storm develop pretty much anywhere by the time we get into September. By the time we get into October, we're still seeing some development off the east coast of the United States, some maybe right around Cuba as well, but a lot of these storms don't tend to reach land because at this point we're starting to see our cold fronts move across the country, and those cold fronts are powerful enough that if a front is coming and a storm is here, it'll just pick that storm up and move it right on along. So a lot of times these storms will start to head north, run into a cold front, and then just kind of get shot on off towards the east. And then in November, we still have a little bit of development, mainly in the southern Atlantic. But a lot of times, again, these storms remain fish storms. They just kind of, again, skirt on off out into the Atlantic as well. So just something to kind of keep in mind there. Where our storms develop and then eventually where they head off to. So I think our next thing is going to be, portions of the storm as well as the Saffir-Simpson scale, and then kind of some of the hazards that come with hurricanes. So we'll talk about that when we come back in just a second.